The Black Death in Medieval Europe, the Bubonic Plague, 1346 to 1353. The spread of the plague to Europe and Africa. So the plague outbreak of the mid-14th century, which is also the same thing as the mid-1300s, started in Asia, one of the places where the disease is endemic, which means that the disease is constantly there in a small way. That's different from an epidemic where it goes everywhere all the time. The disease remains minimally endemic in the United States, parts of Africa, and Asia. So there are still places where the plague is out there. New Mexico, where I'm from, is one of them. There's every now and then a few cases of plague, way less dangerous than it used to be, but the disease remains endemic. Back in this time, however, the plague killed perhaps 25 million people in Asia and North Africa, although this lecture will focus on the European effects given where we are in the class. Mongol expansion had rebuilt trade routes along the Silk Roads, as you guys know, and disease was thus able to spread along those routes. The disease is also generally spread by fleas on brown rats. That's kind of the main vector for the disease, so is fleas. And rats, of course, carry fleas, although those fleas will bite humans as well. So if the rats die or the cats who catch the rats die, the fleas will go after the next warmest thing, and that'll be humans. When the disease becomes common enough in a large population, it will become pneumonic. So there's just sort of a statistical chance that if enough people get the plague, it will become a pneumonic version of the plague, which means it's in your lungs, and that means it can be spread by air. When the disease goes pneumonic, it becomes amazingly contagious because you don't need to be bitten by a flea. It's just be in the room with someone breathing. And so the disease has this kind of natural progression to explode. It is very spreadable. Back in the day. I mean, today we have no problem with it. The symptoms of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague is a bacteriological infection, and it creates a massive immune reaction, and that actually is what gives the disease its name. So your lymph nodes, which are at basically all your joints, are going to swell super painfully as they fill up with pus and things like that, as your body tries to fight off the bubonic plague. And those swellings that you'll get all over your body are called buboes. And because, when your skin swells like that, it will bruise. Those swellings will be dark, usually like black and blue kind of, but they, over time, looked very black, especially compared to other skin. And once they would get really old, they would get black. And between that and the fever and the side effects and all this stuff, it really could overwhelm your body and kill you. And even more disturbingly, if a ton of people got the disease all at once, so in a place where the disease was striking fresh, then everyone would get it all at once. And so even if you were starting to recover, you might die from just lack of water and food because everybody was sick. So when it did strike in an epidemic fashion, it was amazingly deadly. If you leave it untreated, which obviously happened back in the Middle Ages, unlike today, you can get death rates anywhere from 30 to 75%. And in some rare cases where an entire village would get sick, literally everyone might die. But in general, for large populations, it tends to be anywhere from 30 to 75%, depending on how severe the present outbreak is. And I just want to make a note about the use of capitalization here. When you use the word the plague with a small p, that can be any old plague because there have been a lot of them. But if you see the plague with a capital P, that does mean specifically the bubonic plague. So the spread of the plague in Europe. The plague spread along trade routes by and large, and a lot of those trade routes had been brought in by the Crusades, or built after the Crusades. And unfortunately, that was going to open the door to the plague in Europe. So Genoese and Venetians had been some of the people who had carried Crusaders to and from the Holy Land, or what the Europeans were calling the Holy Land. And then those traders also carried goods and stuff after the Crusades failed. And those trade routes had then expanded up into the Black Sea, which is where the Europeans ran into the Silk Road and to Mongolians who were unfortunately carrying the plague with them, and that transferred off to the Europeans. Europe at the time was already pretty overpopulated. It was the high Middle Ages. The population had grown kind of to the limits of what the technology of the time could support. And as a result, a lot of people in Europe were not well fed. That meant that they were just much more likely to die from the plague or even to get the plague, although it's a very transmissible disease, because they were weak and poor. And that's often a problem with diseases. The places where you get a lot of mutations, where you get a lot of really quick spread, are amongst people who aren't well fed. And in Europe during this time, you'd also seen some natural climate fluctuations that added to that. So there'd been like a little ice age kind of thing, and it had left people on the edge of starvation anyway, which made them very vulnerable. And the disease was also just spread, in addition to through trade routes, primarily, and you can definitely see that on the maps. But it also spread just as people panicked and fled. So, if the plague broke out in your town, you would immediately realize things were terrible, and you would pack up and run. The problem with that system is that, of course, the people who are packing up and running have contracted the disease but don't yet have symptoms, so they just carry it to the next village, and it breaks out there, and it just keeps moving. And so in a weird way, the plague kind of spread at the speed of running in the Middle Ages in Europe. As people tried to avoid it, they of course just spread it. That's why quarantines and that sort of thing are necessary. So here we see a map that kind of explains the spread of the plague, and you can see up here the plague is coming in from the Silk Road, by the Silk Road that the Mongolians had rebuilt. Genoese and Venetian traders, here's Venice, here's Genoa, had been the people who'd run the trade routes. And so basically by ship, the plague spread all throughout the Mediterranean world. In a weird way, the ending of the Middle Ages, as Europe began to trade more, unfortunately made it also more vulnerable to the plague. But you can kind of see the first places it came in 1347, Orange, and those are all like cities connected to the trade routes. And then it spreads very quickly into the interior of Europe, and you can really see the kind of spread over time of the plague as it moves forward. Mostly that's through records of like deaths and burials in like village Bibles and things like that. The thing that always makes people curious is this right here, the relatively unaffected region. And that is, it's not like nobody there got the plague or they were genetically incapable of getting the plague, but for a lot of reasons, either bad records or just one of the quirks of history that we don't understand, this was a relatively, as far as we can tell, unaffected region. But the rest of this part of Europe, basically you saw 30 to 70% of people die. Here's just another version of the map that might make a little more sense to you. And it also highlights the kind of maritime and land trade routes along which the plague spread. It also shows you that Europe was beginning to trade. And this one you also don't see the same version of there not being an effect. So there is kind of a difference between the historical records there. And here you see a medieval image drawn at the time of people burying, and so you get a sense for just the scale of how many people died. Of course, like actually burying all these bodies would also be problematic because you're probably going to have fleas hopping off the body. The bodies are very infectious, so people might even, be contracting the plague right here. On the other hand, if you'd already had the plague and survived it, you couldn't get it again. So there was good money to be made in the disposal of the dead because nobody wanted to touch or go near them. And if you had survived it, you could get paid a lot of money to be a gravedigger and a burier of bodies, although obviously that's not a very fun job. Treatment of the plague in medieval times is generally a nightmare. Really, as far as the medicine and knowledge they had available to them at the time, and this was everywhere. This was in China, this was in Japan, this would have been in South Asia, Middle East, the Muslim world, you name it. There really wasn't any way to treat the disease like we have today. So basically, you just had to have a lot of rest. Somebody had to feed you, and ideally, you'd have access to water. And if those things were available, you had a chance of surviving. Obviously, since most people got the disease at the same time, a lot of those things failed. And so people who might otherwise have survived died for lack of water, which is a really horrifying way to go. They did do quarantines. That word actually comes from Venice, which had a history with trade and disease. And so they had a rule called the quarenta, where you had to stay on an island for 40 days to make sure you didn't have a disease. So people did try quarantines. They almost invariably failed because, as we've seen in our own present COVID-19 times, people ignore the rules, people bend the rules to get their friends in. So these things didn't usually work. And let's see what else. They did have doctors, barber surgeons, people who could do basic stuff. Although, God, you never wanted to go to a doctor back in the Middle Ages. They did things like bleeding you, so they actually cut your a vein open and tried to bleed out the bad humors, the bad poisons, which of course is suicidal, a terrible idea. And even worse, since they didn't have any idea of hygiene, they just used the same knife on multiple people. So they actually spread the plague instead of actually doing anything other than making it harder for you to survive. They also did things like create little pouches of like flowers and things like that, a pocket full of posies, so that you would have good smells around you, which weirdly they believed would keep the plague away, which obviously it did not. This is a early Renaissance painting. So after the plague and after Europe began to move out of the Middle Ages, people began to paint a little better. And so this painting shows like just what a town might look like. And this is not extreme, aside from God up there at the top. But people literally did die in the streets, and no one wanted to touch them. And they had, as you're seeing here, mass burnings of bodies and things like that. It was something that we cannot even really get our heads around how awful that would be. COVID has been bad, but nothing like this has occurred. Another gruesome picture from the time. Obviously no photographs, but people did draw badly. And so you can see the disposal of bodies, which of course would probably also be spreading the plague. And the total death toll was, of course, very, very high. 30 to 50% of the entire European population died, which is a truly amazingly large number of people. And the population of Europe did not recover for at least 150 more years. So, like, it was a hit to Europe and its population. Same thing, although on a lower level, because the disease had been more prevalent earlier in China, and therefore people were a little more immune to it. In other places, the disease might have been slightly less bad, but either way, it was a massive Afro-Eurasian disaster that killed tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. And the places that were urban, like in the United States during COVID-19, or everywhere during COVID-19 actually, places where people were in cities, which were actually quite small in Europe, luckily, in a weird way, because the Europeans were so primitive, they didn't have big cities, maybe 100,000, 80,000 people tops in London and Paris. That is where the disease really was just catastrophic, because people were, cheek by jowl, very closely packed together with tons of rats, and that just was a disaster, especially when the disease went pneumonic and you began to see, I believe in Paris there were as many as 800 burials a day, which is just mind-blowing. And here is just a perspective graphic. It doesn't show COVID on here yet, or not in a reasonable way, because this was done back in March of 2019. So this is right at the beginning of COVID. So COVID will move up a little bit, but either way, it's a fairly small disease compared to the big ones here. It might get close to HIV/AIDS, but I doubt it. But certainly the Black Death, with its probable 200 million people killed worldwide, is difficult to get your head around. All of that 200 million people is over the course of the Black Death, because it continues to go on today, although today almost nobody dies of it. Remixing power in medieval Europe. Oddly, the plague actually, if you survived it, had a fairly positive impact on Europe. It lowered the population really radically, which was going to have big impacts, and it just shifted who had power, which was also going to have big impacts. So obviously, because they had no medicine that counted, you were just as likely to die of the disease if you're rich as if you were poor. And a very large percentage of powerful people died. And that basically shook up power. It meant that, traditional crusty old people who had, been inheriting power forever died. Or, you might get like the third son instead of the first son inheriting power. And so traditional power was a lot weaker. You didn't have the right people in place. They weren't as experienced. There was just a lot of lost knowledge. And in a way that was good, because obviously the way power had been done in medieval Europe was idiotic. And so the other similar thing is that the huge power of the Catholic Church, because there was only the church, was heavily weakened. This was in Europe a time of very religious fundamentalism, which was often very bad news for the Jews of Europe. But it was also a time when nobody could change anything, because the church was so powerful, and they would say these things can't be done. And while when the plague struck, a lot of people became a lot less religious. Like, why trust God if he's smacking down all these people kind of at random? A lot of priests who were supposed to be there to hear your last words and your last right and give you last rites were like, I'm not going in that room. And so tons of people were like, why should I trust a church that abandons me when I need it? And there was the basic fact that, like, you would know, like, I did bad things, I survived. My lovely grandma, who did lovely things her whole life, died. Where is the justice in that? And finally, established priests died, just like established nobles died. So, like, a lot of people, churches were suddenly staffed by the people who were, like, the sweepers or the house cleaners because there was no one else to do it. And so the church's power was wildly weakened. And that made it possible for people to be more experimental, scientifically and various other ways. So the plague, in a weird way, by killing a ton of powerful people, probably made things able to go better. Women in particular had a short moment, which would go away again later, unfortunately, where they did have access to power. Because if all the men in the family died, adult women were suddenly like, damn, this person has to be a duke or a duchess, and we have to actually listen to her because we need our family power to stay together. And with the church weakened, that also helped the role of women, because at this time the church was fairly conservative about the role of women. So the plague did some good things. And one of the crucial things that the plague did was break up that feudal power structure. The social structure changed really radically for average people. A lot of wealth changed hands. Whole families would die, leaving their houses abandoned. And, if you'd had the plague and survived, or if you were willing to take the risk, you could just walk into a castle, steal a bunch of stuff. So a whole lot of money changed hands. And that meant that every now and then money would end up in inventive hands, hands willing to take risks, unlike in the medieval world where everyone was just like, I'm giving this to my oldest son and we're going to not screw anything up. The plague just like rained money around weirdly, and some of that money ended up in good hands. Obviously, it ended the overpopulation problem by just killing a ton of the population, which meant that suddenly your average person had more food, more wealth, because there just weren't as many people for the same amount of developed land. Serfs in particular and peasants suddenly found it possible to kind of like demand better treatment because there just weren't enough serfs anymore. And, if you had a bad knight or duke or count or whatever, or daimyo in Japan, running your life, you could suddenly say, like, I'm going to leave and move to another manor. And in the old days, that wasn't allowed, and nobody had any space for extra serfs anyway. But now, and the next knight over could like steal the other guy's serfs. And the other knight would show up and be like, "Those are my serfs," and the new knight would be like, "Nope, had them my whole life." And that kind of break amongst the nobility is a new thing, and so this really did help people. If you didn't die, you were probably doing better after the plague. And the economy began to pick up in Europe. In a weird way, the plague was kind of the best thing that could have happened to Europe. Although it wasn't a good thing for women and Jews during the plague. And one of the things that happened is that these wildly ignorant people, and this is pretty worldwide, although particularly brutal for Jews in Europe, was that people looked for someone to blame for the plague, and Europeans blamed whoever they could. Obviously, they blamed the devil. These were extremely religious people, and the imagery in the paintings of this time often have some really terrifying looking devils. And people also blamed themselves as sinners, and they felt like, that people hadn't been sufficiently religious, and so people wandered around whipping themselves in these crazy carnivals, or wearing hair shirts, all kinds of creepy stuff to be like trying to get God to stop killing them. And other people obviously took the other route of like, I don't even believe in God anymore because there's no way a just and decent God would allow this to happen. But so there was a lot of blaming either of God or of themselves for having been sinners. Anybody weird, like a witch, an unusual woman, a mentally ill person in the village, was probably going to be in a lot of trouble as the person who caused the plague. If you can imagine this thing popping out of nowhere, and you're totally dumb, you might make some really weird decisions about how it had happened. Like, for instance, some of our paranoid conspiracy theories around COVID are obviously pretty odd, like, blaming it on the Chinese as if somehow the Chinese would bother to invent a disease that killed a crapload of their own people, or having bizarre thoughts about like the vaccines have microchips in it. Like, this kind of crazy behavior happened in the Middle Ages, and it still kind of happens today. Unfortunately, the biggest targets were the Jews. Jews were a minority within Europe. They'd been there forever, longer than the Christians, actually. They were Europeans. And yet, because they were a minority and they weren't the right religion in a place dominated by very religious Christian people, Jews were often blamed for the plague, murdered in giant numbers, abused, discriminated against, and generally tortured and killed. They survived. Because the Jews are tough people, but these were very bad times for the Jews.